and on behalf of the Migration Mobilities Bristol, I welcome you to this webinar titled Protecting Venezuelans in Colombia, Reflections from Across the Region, an event organized by the MMB. Beforehand, I would like to tell you that the Migration Mobilities Bristol is a specialist research institute at the University of Bristol, built up by an interdisciplinary network of academics and others with diverse interests ranging from politics to film studies, history, and law. Within the MMB, there is a wide and active group of scholars researching migration and mobility related issues in Latin America. And as part of this group, we have a series called Latin American Dialogues. There are online conversations between MMB members in Bristol and colleagues in Latin America who share special areas of interest in the field of migration and mobility studies. And indeed, this event is part of this series. As well, we have the MMB Latin American blog, where we often post blogs from researchers from across the region in English, in Spanish, and in Portuguese. So this is a good opportunity for encouraging those interested to get in contact with us if you would like to share your ideas. And in this opportunity, we'll have the chance of listening to Diego Acosta, Alexandra Castro, Soledad Castillo, and Marcia Vera, talking about the Colombian government recently announced program intended to grant 10-year complementary protection and legal status to the approximately 1.7 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees living in the country. The speakers will also contrast the program with the practices of other South American countries and will reflect on why neighboring governments should pay close attention to this landmark decision. Each speaker will take 10 minutes. And if anyone from the audience would like to make a question, please use the Q&A box and I will read them once all the speakers have done their presentation. We're going to start with Diego Acosta. Diego Acosta is Professor of European and Migration Law at the Bristol Law School and MMB International Strategic Lead. He worked with governments, law firms, and international organizations in Latin America and other regions. Diego, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ignacio, and welcome everyone to this seminar. I'm going to be very brief, and I'm going to give you an overview of the regulation of migration and citizenship in South America, and later our speakers will give more precise examples about Colombia, Peru, and Chile. So I'm just going to make 4 introductory points to put the debate into a more regional context. So the first point that I would like to make is that the immigration of Venezuelans is absolutely unprecedented in the region. It is unprecedented in modern times because for the last few decades, South America has received very little immigration. This is not the case historically, and this is something that people tend to forget. Historically, South America between 1880 and 1930, so in the period of the large European emigration, it was the second region in the world that received more migrants only after the US, particularly Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. But even during that period, that immigration that arrived to South America in large numbers was much more progressive. It was much more slow in the sense of not being so sudden as the more than 5 million Venezuelans that have basically emigrated in the last 5 years, most of them, or around 80% of them, to actually South America. So after the Second World War, or after 1930, and then more in particular after the Second World War, immigration to South America stopped. Actually from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, what we have rather is emigration of South Americans going abroad, to, in some cases actually to Venezuela, and in other cases to the US and later to Europe. And we also have to remember that Venezuela was always a country of immigration. Venezuela was never a country of emigration, even in the period of South American emigration when that started in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. So this is just to put the context of Venezuela Venezuelan migrants into that historical context. The second point that I would like to make is that despite the fact that such a large number or such a large scale of immigrants is unprecedented in the region, it is true that countries in South America have a very long history of regulating migration and citizenship. This is a 200 years history. These are all states with 2 centuries of history. And from the very beginning, immigration was at the center of their constitutional debates. And that is why from the very beginning, they started regulating the status of foreigners, the status of newcomers into these newly created states. So from the beginning of the 19th century. And we have always had in that regulation a juxtaposition between openness and restrictiveness. But at the same time, we have always had a narrative of openness. So South American governments have always been willing to present themselves as being open when it comes to the arrival of foreigners, and in any case, more open than the usual comparisons they have used, which are namely the US and more recently the European Union. And this narrative of being open has accentuated in the late 20th century and early 21st century, coinciding with large emigration flows from South America going mostly to the US, but also to Europe, primarily to Spain. And that political discourse of openness has also led to the adoption of, or to the emergence of certain legal principles, for example, non-criminalization of irregular migration, or the idea of the right to migrate as a fundamental right. And some of these emerging political first principles, but then later legal principles have actually been enshrined in some of the new immigration laws adopted in the region in the 21st century in the different countries in South America. That is my second point. The third point that I would like to make is that the constitutional architecture of the state in South America gives a lot of prevalence to the executives. Executive power is at the center of the regulation, not only of many other matters, but also at the center of the regulation of citizenship and migration, both historically and also today. And that is very important in order to understand what have been the legal responses to the arrival of Venezuelans in the different South American countries. To conclude, my last point, my fourth point, is precisely about that, right? What have been, if we have to categorize the legal responses of South American governments to the arrival of Venezuelans, how can we find some common categories or some common understandings or some commonalities between those different legal responses? And I will say a couple of points. The first one is that, as I mentioned, the executive has led on those responses. So we have not necessarily seen the adoption of new laws that have incorporated certain principles to facilitate the arrival of Venezuelans. What we have seen rather is the adoption of decrees, or even in some cases lower norms, which have been used to regulate the arrival of Venezuelans. So the executive has been at the center of the legal responses, and that has meant that in certain countries, those legal responses have changed when the government has changed. For example, in the case of Bolivia, that was clear in 2019, 2020. The second element is that these responses have been temporary responses. So in many cases, these decrees that have been adopted had always a deadline after which they were no longer valid. And that has been the case for Peru, for Colombia, but also, for example, the first decree that was, or the first actually executive decree that was adopted in Brazil in 2017 was only valid for a year. Then it was re-adopted in 2018 with a longer period of validity. And that has led to my third point, which is that many of the legal statuses that have been granted to Venezuelans have been ambiguous and have led to legal uncertainty, precisely because there was this strong temporary component attached to them. For example, that is the case in Paraguay, where residence permits that Venezuelans can obtain are only valid for a year. A fourth point is that in some cases, the arrival of Venezuelans has led to the collapse of immigration laws. So immigration laws, as I mentioned, were becoming more open in the 21st century when immigration numbers were low, but it has been harder for them to remain at that level of openness when the numbers have increased. And the most the clearest example of that is the case of Ecuador, where the 2017 immigration law incorporated a chapter establishing that all South American citizens had the right to enter, reside, and work in Ecuador. And that chapter in the law has been derogated in 2020, obviously following the arrival of an important number of Venezuelans. Actually, Ecuador is the fourth largest recipient of Venezuelans in South America. And my final point is that has led to a lot of irregularity. It is true that hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans in the region have obtained residence permits through these temporary permits that have been adopted through executive decrees mostly. But it is also true that hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans have not been able to obtain any residence permit. And therefore, we have more or less a situation where half of the Venezuelans were or are at the moment undocumented in South America. They are in an irregular situation. And that is also the case in Colombia, as Alexandra will explain later, where until the adoption of this new decree, or still today, 55% of the Venezuelans that are in Colombia are irregular. And that is similar in other countries in the region. With the exception perhaps of Argentina and Uruguay, which have taken a different approach. And what they have done is to use regional free movement frameworks, namely the Mercosur Residence Agreement, to grant a residence status to Venezuelans, which in my view has been a better option in the sense of being much more permanent and offering better legal certainty to Venezuelans in those two countries. So I leave it there and I conclude there. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Diego. Thank you very much. Now we'll follow with Alexandra. Alexandra Castro is the founder and researcher of the International Migration Observatory of the Universidad Externado de Colombia. She works as a lawyer specializing in international migration and human rights, and as a researcher at the think tank Diásporas. Alexandra, thank you very much.
Thank you. I start by thanking Diego, Emily, and yourself for this invitation. I will now share my screen so you can see my presentation. It's okay? You see it?
Perfect, yeah.
So I'll start quickly by a little bit of context as well, speaking a little bit about this special permit of protection permit, like a bet for the future that has just been adopted by the Colombian government. But before starting, we need to give a little information about what has been happening between these two countries. Colombia and Venezuela share a really long border of more than 2,000 kilometers. There are this border consists on a lot of things such as rivers, mountains, deserts, and there are also strong cultural and historical bonds between the two countries. This is something that makes this migration special. Until not long ago, Venezuela was the main destination country for Colombian migrants who were attracted by Venezuela's flourishing economy or even fleeing the conflict. Since 2015, the number of migrants has been constantly increasing. The situation has been changing, and nowadays we speak about more than 1.7 million migrants that have been arriving into Colombia. Many of them fleeing situations such as starvation or in need of healthcare or other basic services. Most of the Venezuelan migrants in Colombia, as Diego just said, remain in an irregular status in Colombia. They work in the informal market, and it has also been reported that a number of Venezuelans are begging in the streets. Even during the COVID-19 pandemic, 60% of these migrants have been living in precarious conditions. Many have lost their jobs and homes. The borders have been closed. This hasn't stopped deportations and irregular migrations. And even in the recent days, Colombian president had previously said that Venezuelan migrants at irregular condition would not be granted with vaccination against the COVID. So that's the context on which this migration takes place. Now, what has been done? In 7 occasions, Colombia has granted Venezuelan migrants with special permits, allowing them to come forward and obtain a regular status for a 2-year period. So here we see how this is a temporal solution. They need to meet some requirements, including having a passport. And people who have this permit may legally work in the country, access public healthcare system, and access education, among other things. However, this permit has several difficulties, especially as this is conceived as a temporal solution and doesn't correspond to these long-lasting migratory flows. Migrants cannot access, for instance, banking system. There's no control over the legality and validity of the document of the permit, and also they have been having some troubles with xenophobia and other situations that have been raising in the country. There has been also a strong issue on which I cannot speak very long regarding the acquisition of the Colombian nationality, as children born to Venezuelan parents with an irregular status or even with this special permit could not access the Colombian nationality. So a ruling was needed to establish the acquisition or the access to the Colombian nationality for those children and to avoid the statelessness risk. And finally, the majority of migrants couldn't access the permit as they entered the country without a passport. So as they didn't meet all the requirements, they remain irregularly in Colombia. So with this special context, we arrive to this temporal protection permit. Let's say, as we just said before, that this is an important step taken by Colombia based upon the possible positive impact on migration to the country's economy, and it's inspired from the links between migration and development. It is established the regularization of undocumented migrants, and by now it has been said that they need to prove that they entered the country prior to the 31st January 2021, which will mean that those migrants who have entered the country during these 2 months cannot benefit with the permit. Those who legally enter the country during the next 2 years can also access to the permit, and the regularization will benefit more than 800,000 migrants. The temporary protection permits also puts into force a registration system with a biometrical system for registering not only migrants who were previously living in the country, but also those who established in Colombia during the next 2 years. And now I speak what for me is the most important, which are the benefits and the inconveniences of this permit and of this situation. Let's start by the benefits. Colombia is an underdeveloped country with an unemployment rate of 17.3%. Make the decision to grant regular status to migrants who will be accessing the labor market under the consideration that these migrants will contribute to the economy and will add diversity to the markets. It's a really remarkable measure. Also, if you consider the healthcare system and the education system in Colombia, which are already saturated and lacking funding, we can also say that it's a remarkable question, as these aspects are traditionally seen or taken into account for states in order to reject and take restrictive measures against migrations. Colombia has considered differently these aspects, taking into account the educational level of Venezuelan migrants and their possibility to integrate and positively impact the Colombian economy. Even if we cannot totally predict the outcome of these measures in the country's economy and society, we can say without hesitation that they will definitely improve migrants' life. There are many who will be able to legally remain in the country, and this is strongly positive. But now let's speak about the inconveniences of this measure. Let's say that despite all the efforts that have been accomplished to cope with this phenomenon, we yet have to say that Colombia doesn't have a comprehensive migratory policy. Only disperse decrees that give strong powers and dispose little ways to control the action of authority, such as the case of other countries in the region. So these new measures don't make part of a comprehensive effort of migrations governance. And Colombia has other migratory flows nowadays that remain unseen and for which the existing norms raise many concerns, especially in regards of the human rights protection. In the second place, the permit is not by itself a way to integrate for the integration of migrants. As a matter of fact, the increase of migration flows has raised a xenophobic feeling in some part of the population and society, but also in the speech of some public authorities and of the media. In this sense, the country still has strong challenges to cope with this discrimination and these xenophobic practices, attitudes, and speeches. That's the only way to really encourage the migrants' integration in the community. In third place, irregular migration will continue, as many migrants may still not meet the requirements, especially the passport requirement, to legally enter the country. And also, even if the borders are closed right now, there are people who are still entering the country through more than 1,092 irregular paths that exist between the two countries. Nowadays, right now, there are some confrontations between the guerrillas, FARC dissidents, and Venezuelan National Guard in the border between Colombia and Venezuela. There are hundreds of people who are right now fleeing Venezuela to Colombia. These people who is entering now to Colombia will not be able to ask for the permit and will remain illegally in Colombia unless they claim asylum. And that brings me to the fourth point, the asylum institution, which is in Colombia has many inconveniences, and we don't have time here to discuss those inconveniences. But I will say that migrants with this new permit will need to choose whether they want to start and continue with their asylum procedure or if they prefer to access the permit. This will definitely discourage migrants from claiming asylum, as the refugee status gives them less advantages than this permit. So this institution, which is really weak in Colombia, will be weaker with this permit. And the fifth point, the security perception, which we will see, it's also a constant among other countries, is still present in Colombia, despite all the efforts that have been accomplished. The deportation procedures are the same and will be reinforced for all those who don't meet all the requirements for accessing the permit. Right now, the Colombian state is regulating and providing details about how this is going to be the setup for the permit, let's say. And I would like to quote you a phrase from the project of resolution that will be shortly adopted by the Colombian states. And I quote, "The lack of complete and real-time information on the Venezuelan migrant population that is in irregular status in Colombia generates a possible increase in crime." So now we see how there's a link and this has been said by the National Migratory Authority, Migración Colombia. They make a link between crime and irregular migration, and that it's the state of mind of such authority. And that's something that concerns a lot of us, because we see that even we have changed in the policy, even we're making a different policy, we still need to make different things, to take further measures to change these conceptions about migration and migrants. And then, just to end, I would like to go back to my first inconvenience. As we don't have a comprehensive public policy, we really need to think through this, because today it's Venezuelans, tomorrow we don't know who will be crossing our borders. We also have other extracontinental migration flows that are taking place right now, and they are uncovered by any complete policy, migratory policy. Also, this is not a governance effort for migrations. We don't see a balance or a discussion or a participation or a reflection of a discussion among all the public authorities in the country. And this is really a problem for the integration process of the migrants. However, we need to put into the balance the benefits and the inconveniences of the measure. We think it's something remarkable and necessary for the Venezuelan migrants, and this will definitely improve the life of many of them, but there are still some challenges that need to be faced in order to make this a really good public policy. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexandra. And now, following Alexandra, we'll have the chance of listening to Soledad Castillo Jara. Soledad Castillo Jara holds a BA in Political Science from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Perú. She's a research assistant at the Centro de Investigación at the Universidad del Pacífico in Lima. She works on the politics of migration in Latin America and has published widely on the impact of COVID-19 on migrants in the region. Soledad, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation. Today, I will summarize the measures taken by the Peruvian government regarding Venezuelan migrants and refugees, and contrast those measures with the topic of this dialogue, which is the Colombian temporary protection status, which, as all of us know, was considered historical by the United Nations, and which I also consider a valuable source of lessons for the Latin American region. First, in order to understand properly the measures taken by the Peruvian government, we have to understand two parts. First, the entry to Peru, which is related to border control, and second, the stay in Peru, which is related to regularization, documents, and access to services for daily life. First, regarding the entry to Peru, the government is enhancing border security and putting emphasis on the fight against smuggling and human trafficking, and also on the enforcement of sanitary controls in borders due to the worldwide context of the pandemic that we are all going through. And the government counts on the participation of the national police and the armed forces for all these efforts. However, the main shortcoming of this approach is that it has led to a militarization of borders, which has not been properly complemented with attention to vulnerabilities. And as we know, we in Peru, we are facing some contexts of forced displacement of people from neighboring countries. In our northern border, we face the displacement of many Venezuelan citizens. And in the border with Brazil, we have had recently a 3-week-long crisis because of migration flows of people not coming to stay in Peru, but passing through Peru in order to continue their journey up north. And they were mainly migrants of Haitian and African origin. And in those contexts, there are many people with vulnerabilities, such as older adults, pregnant women, teenagers, children. And so far, there has been militarization in Peruvian borders, but it has not been complemented with the proper attention to these vulnerable situations led by the state. There have been civil society organizations and international organizations, churches also helping, but not the state. So there is a need for a more integral attention of those vulnerabilities, for more coordination between the national level of government and regional and local governments, which means cities, mainly border cities. And also it is necessary to grant the internationally recognized right to ask for asylum in the borders. Now moving on to the second part, which is the stay in Peru. First of all, we have to know that there are two parts here. In Peru, we regulate migration through the Interior Ministry, which is in charge of the National Migration Superintendence, which controls passports and has to do with documentation. And also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which participates with matters regarding asylum and refugee policy and all which is related to the accomplishment of the international compromises of Peru. So currently, the National Migration Superintendence is implementing a pre-registration of migrants, which is open for all nationalities, not only Venezuelan citizens, but all foreigners who are currently in a regular situation in Peru. This means for people who entered irregularly, or also for those who entered regularly but had their documents expired during the period of national emergency due to the pandemic, for example. This pre-registration has had so far 2 phases. Now we are currently in the 3rd phase, which the deadline was extended until the 7th of April, so it will last a few days more. And until now, around 318,000 migrants have registered from around 100 nationalities, so this is positive. Since this pre-registration is going to be useful for both parties, for migrants and for the state. For migrants, it's useful because the data will be useful for access to the vaccination against COVID, so it's important that they register, and also for a future regularization through a document which is called CPP. It's a temporary stay permit card, which was announced last October. And this card is supposed to bring the benefits that migratory regularization normally entails, such as facilitated access to the formal labor market and access to public services such as health, insurance, education, etc. And also this pre-registration, as I said, is useful for the state. The Peruvian state is going to gather socio-demographic data and data related to the professions and labor experiences of migrants, which, if adequately used, may help for the economic inclusion of migrants. Because as we know, most Venezuelan migrants, for example, are young, they are of working age, they have professions which may help the Peruvian economy. And so they can help the state because the state collects taxes according to the migrant income. And so if migrants are properly included in the formal labor market, both migrants and the state win. But the critics or shortcomings of this CPP, which I have already mentioned, are that this is, and here I come to the contrast with the Colombian temporary protection status, because as we know, the Colombian temporary protection status lasts for 10 years. While the CPP is temporary, it is only supposed to last for 1 year. So in the Colombian experience, I see more sustainability, and in those 10 years, migrants can then be included or be upgraded to, for example, resident visas, and they can accumulate the years needed for the regularization according to the ordinary system of migration. So it is like a path of opportunity for the future. While here in Peru, we have a lot of uncertainty. Those temporary permits which last 1 year as the CPP, and previously the PTP, which was another permit which lasted only from 2017 to 2018. So there is no sustainability in Peru, and I think this is a lesson that can be learned from the Colombian experience. And a second lesson would be pragmatism, pragmatism from the government, as in opposition to the politicization of migration which we have currently in Peru. So as was previously explained, Colombia is effectively recognizing the potential of migration for development, mainly the potential of young people who can contribute to the country. Here in Peru, this potential also exists, but we have still a way to go in order to recognize this properly and to provide mechanisms for regularization and for economic and social inclusion of those migrants. We are currently in an electoral context also, because we will hold elections in April, and we don't know what is going to happen with the next government, since there are some candidates which have also a discourse which is mistrustful of migrants, which is sometimes xenophobic, and so there is uncertainty, and we do not know what is going to happen. So in this context, I think we need more sustainability and more pragmatism and sensibility, as in opposition to politicization. And I think these two lessons are lessons that we can learn from the Colombian experience. Fortunately, the Peruvian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has stated that it is open to learn from the Colombian experience, which is good also, and Peru continues to honor its international commitments, like, for example, the participation in the Quito process, the exchange of goods within international spaces and consultation mechanism. And it is also participating as a country in the migration governance indicators made by the IOM. So this means that all ministries within the Peruvian government are going to be evaluated with those indicators regarding their treatment and services for migrants. And this will provide us, our government, with a feedback which will serve for future improvement. And there is also active interest in developing these indicators, not only for the national government, but also for cities. For example, the city of Lima, which is the capital city where almost 80% of the Venezuelan migrants and refugees live. So in conclusion, I think we have those two lessons to learn: sustainability and pragmatism. And there is still much room for improvement in the Peruvian migration and refugee governance. Thank you.
Okay, Soledad, thank you very much. And last but not least, we'll have a chance of listening to Marcia Vera Espinosa. She is a lecturer in human geography at Queen Mary University in London, and her research focuses on refugee and migrant inclusion, forced migration, and immigration policies in Latin America. Marcia?
Thank you so much, Ignacio, and good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you join us today. Thank you so much to Ignacio, Diego, and Emily for inviting us to really discuss the impact of the Colombian temporary protective status, and actually to think in a more comparative way about what is happening in the rest of the region and what we can learn, what are the main takeoff of this new measure that has received so much praise, not only across Latin America, but across the world. On my case in particular, we'd like to open the discussion in the case of what is going on in Chile at the moment, and what are the lessons the country could take from Colombia, but also what are some contextual aspects that might be putting some caution to the widespread calls to learn from this particular program. So what are the things that maybe we can take some reservations, and also maybe some reasons why Chile might not be at that moment yet to take a regularization path like this one. Of course, this discussion drew from some ongoing research that we are conducting with my colleagues at Caminar, which is a research group on comparative analysis on international migration and displacement in the Americas. As part of that project, we have been looking in particular at the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic in migrant refugee populations in 7 countries of the region. But in order to do so, we had to actually explore what was already there. So if we understand a little bit what was happening in Chile before the pandemic, what is happening now, it kind of gives us a broad picture of how actually Chile has been transitioning to a more restrictive approach to migration management, and actually to approach to control more than management alone in relation to migration. And this happened already even before the pandemic arrived, at the beginning of last year, because as you might know, in the context of Chile, when President Sebastián Piñera arrived to the country at the beginning of 2018, a month after he arrived to government, he already came and put an emphasis on this migration reform that included several elements, but in a way that further the politicization of migration in the case of Chile and put an emphasis in how to make migration part of the public agenda, which until then wasn't necessarily part of the agenda. Of course, this can relate with the growing numbers of not only Venezuelan migrants, but other intra-regional migrants and extra-regional migrants to Chile as well. But it took as well a particular emphasis on what to think and how to think about migration. And there were different elements. One of them was the reform to the migration law, that as many of you might know, the migration law that is currently still in place in Chile comes from the dictatorship period. And there's already a reform that Piñera had imposed in the first period of his government, 2013, and that it was resting in parliament. In the government of Michelle Bachelet, in her second government, there were attempts again of putting a reform together, but there were so many frictions between the ministries, in this case of Justice and Foreign Affairs and Interior, that actually forbid that proposal ever saw light. And that was a very good thing for Piñera, because they pick it up, say that, and they say there's a complete chaos and we need to clean up the house. So that became a logo and a motto that they use. Together with this migration reform, that it was very much framed in the language of the Global Compact on Migration that at the end they ended up not signing, was that we have to, thrive from a safe, orderly, and regularized migration. So everything they framed it under that context. And they imposed 2 executive decrees, as Diego explained at the beginning, that created the visa of democratic responsibility for Venezuelans that could be issued, it changed later on in any Chilean consulate, but it was subject to specific requirements such as passport, an ID card, and a proof of non-criminal record. And that, of course, has been canceled now at the moment in the context of the pandemic. And they also imposed a consulate visa for Haitians with very different frames at that time. This is similar to what happened in other countries of the region. Of course, here, Ecuador and Peru, they also put some visas that impose some de facto barriers to the legal entries of and targeted nationalities in particular. Now, at the same time, together with this migration reform in 2018, Piñera has been consistently trying to reinforce this practice of mass deportations, a key feature and really a communication campaign that criminalized migration, reproducing ideas about good and bad migrants that we have seen also in other countries. Let me remind you that in the case of Chile, Venezuelans represent more than 30% of the total foreign population in the country, which it has grown exponentially from the beginning of the 2000s. So if at some point it was really almost a 1%, we are now more than 7% of the total population is from foreign origin. So there has been, of course, an increased visibilization of migration that comes together with a growing criminalization. Let me make a fast forward to what happened since the pandemic came. Because in that moment, we saw an increase of scope, not only in Chile, but in countries across the region, of border closures that we all accepted because it was part of the mitigation measures taken in relation to the pandemic. But has that imposed really serious pressures to the migrant communities? Because many of them were forced to immobility in one or the other side of the border. And migration, again, has been constantly used as a political campaign by the government, in many cases, as many colleagues in Chile have explored, as one communication campaign that is used every time that things are not going good with the management of the pandemic as well. Even the government, as we explore in a paper that we recently published with my colleague Ferin Freyer and Frontiers in Human Dynamics, there has been a constant criminalization and racialization of migration, not only from the Chilean society, but from the government themselves. They start accusing migrants, particularly irregular migrants, as being a vector of the transmission of disease, something that has been done before in the country as well. They have, of course, like in the case of Peru, militarized the borders as well, allowing them, to contribute to the management of migration. The closure of borders has been increasing the arrival of migrants from irregularized channels, which also was another opportunity for Piñera to dress all these migrants in white PPE, protection equipment, and deport them back to Venezuela without the due process in many cases, and there were some legal challenges there. What is important here that we see an increase and a systematized, restrictionist approach to migration governance in Chile, that the pandemic has provided an ideal scenario to conduct and carry on these projects. And these affect particularly to the Venezuelan population, because if you look at the data in relation to asylum applications, for example, in the last few years, there has been a decrease, not only in the applications, but actually a decrease of the approvals as well. So if you look at the first semester of 2020, there were more than 400 applications, and many of them from Venezuelan nationals, and only 7 of them were approved by the Chilean government. So as Alexandra correctly emphasized at the beginning, there's an increase, not only in Chile, but in many countries of the region, an increased reduction of the spaces of protection in relation to asylum and refugee commitments that not only Chile, but many of the countries of the region have taken. This is a very grim panorama, what I'm telling you in the case of Chile, and of course I'm not getting into each of detail, but I thought it was important in order to discuss what to take now. What are the main takeaways that we can take from the Colombian experience? Of course, the main one is the effort for regularization, which has also been a call from the migrant and migrant-led organizations and civil society organizations in the case of Chile, but also across the region. So as you might know, many countries in the region and migrant-led organizations joined the campaign Regularization Now, Regularización Ya, that they have been promoting widely across the countries of the region. And that's something that is relevant to consider now, because not only gives them access to social protection, so much needed in the context of the pandemic, but also to vaccination protocols and other social economic rights that are necessary for migrants. But at the same time, because regularization, we know, is a pathway to residency. And this, I want to pick it up, the good point that Soledad made in terms of the pragmatic approach. One of the interesting things from the Colombian case is that by giving a 10-year, framework, is of course larger than the year or 2-year, temporary permits that we have seen across the region. And at the same time, you don't tell them that it's permanent. So you can manage the expectations of their own Colombian population. So in one way, it really works quite smart from one way and another one. So that, I think, is something that we should take, that Chile definitely should consider. But then I was thinking, what factors might prevent the adoption of a similar framework besides the politicization of migration? And there are a couple that come to mind. One of them is funding. Of course, Colombia, after the peace process of 2016, has been a focus of funding of, different international donors, but also international organizations. In the case of Chile, Chile is classified as an emerging high-income country, graduated from the official development assistance list in 2017, which already limits the funding that they can get, even in terms of humanitarian grounds. So there's maybe a lack of international support to consider there. Also, in the case of Chile, particularly because they have self-identified as a reception country, they have been increasingly comparing themselves with more Western industrialized main destination countries like the US, Europe, etc. So those are the models that are looking in terms of migration management, not necessarily the countries of the region. And as Soledad raised a very good point, we have to see how Colombia can diffuse some of the ideas of the program to the rest of the countries of the region for them to adopt them. And I only have 1 minute, so I just want to raise another brief point about this, and happy to discuss more in the Q&A later on. What can we be cautious about that? Of course, and this is something, a point that my colleagues raised as well, we cannot think about regularization without integration. And here, I think we need to go beyond the metrics alone. There's a very, very interest, from particularly UN agencies to think about index and metrics for everything. But we need to think about policies as well in order to strengthen social cohesion. What do we understand about integration in the region, and how we put both policies together? Not only the ones that regulate who enters for how long and, and under what conditions, but how do we guarantee that they become part of the society? Also, we can see how these temporary measures, including the Colombian one, is a further threat to the, and it doesn't live up really to the commitments that the region and the country like Chile has taken in relation to refugee protection and durable solutions. We never talk here about durable solutions. It seems that we erase it from our language so far. And the other thing I see with caution, and this is just thinking far ahead, but happy to have the discussion about it, is that one of the emphasis of the Colombian process now is this raise of biometrics as a management tool that actually reinforce this idea of migration industry that might be taking place in the region as well. So I think we have to be cautious in what happened with that, what happened with that data, how it's going to be used, and which new non-state actors are going to join some of these processes. I run out my time, so I'm going to leave it there, but I hope we can keep chatting about this in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcia, for your presentation. And just to remember those who join us later, if you would like to make a question, you can use the Q&A box. I have a couple of questions here, but before that, maybe we can kind of propose a short reflection about what we have heard from the speakers. I found very interesting all of the presentations, but what I found is that it is very clear that, that as Marcia was saying, there's a lack of coordination at the regional level. But it's interesting because there's a lack of coordination, but at the same time there are some supranational or supra-governmental forums. For instance, the Grupo de Lima. So to begin with, and before getting into the questions made by the audience, why do you think this lack of coordination happens? What do you think about these different policies, and why do you think beyond Peru and Chile, the other governments from the region are not trying to copy this model that Colombia is proposing? Who would like to answer, and then I will read the questions made by the audience.
If I may start answering, I agree that there's absolutely a lack of cooperation in this matter, and this shows us how, despite the fact that there are many international organizations in Latin America, because if you see, we have Mercosur, OEA, UNASUR, Alianza del Pacífico, we have a lot of international organizations. They have failed, and they all have rulings regarding migrations that are supposed to be applied by states. They have all failed in terms of coping with this phenomenon. And this shows us how international cooperation in Latin America is failing, and how all that money that goes to this international organization is not worth, because in times of a crisis as such, they are like, they can't do anything to cope with this. But also, a way to say it, we see kind of the same thing in Europe and in other parts of the world, where in times of not a lot of migration, well, states are willing to cooperate with each other and to coordinate some measures to cope with migration. But in times of crisis, every state is going to hide behind its inner regulation and takes off the card of sovereignty and tells the other state that it's my own business. No one can tell me what to do with this law. And I think this is what we have been seeing with this law. And I think for Colombia, it's a strong challenge to think about its international relations, even with Venezuela, because since 2019, Colombia stopped all the international relations with Venezuela. We don't have consular office in Colombia, and that's really hard for many Venezuelans who need some services from its own authority. So the international relations are really important for a migration governance, and we cannot just manage a migratory flow by ourselves without taking into consideration other states. And I think what might happen is that we will, with the decision that has been taken by Colombia, a bottleneck will be created in Colombia, and migration will continue through the whole continent. That doesn't mean that the fact that we say that they may stay in Colombia for 10 years, that doesn't mean they're going to stay in Colombia. They know they can legally stay there, but the journey will continue. So we will still need to consider international cooperation, and this just shows us that there's a lot to do about it.
May I complement what was said by Alexandra? Well, okay, first of all, I agree with what Alexandra said, in the sense that in times of crisis, the states tend to emphasize their national sovereignty and cooperate less. But I think there are also other problems related to Latin American cooperation and international organizations. And it's that first, there are many organizations, mainly because in the times of the turn to the left, some organizations were created, and then when after elections, some countries turned to the right, and they created different organizations. So it was not a reform of the existing ones, but the creation of new ones, and so there are many, and also because of some politicization of this problem, because of, for example, the Lima group mainly discusses the rupture of the democratic order in Venezuela, and it tries to put diplomatic pressure on Venezuela for this to change. But the migratory issue is not so much discussed. In the Quito process, it is discussed a bit more, but the agreements taken by the Quito process are not binding for states. So once more, states can say that they have national sovereignty and they can just ignore the agreements made.
I would like to say very quickly just one more thing, which I think also complements what Soledad and Alexandra were saying, which is that initially, I think governments in the region expected that this was going to be a temporary crisis. I think a lot of people thought that the Maduro government will eventually fall, and that as a result of that, Venezuelans will go back to Venezuela, considering, as I said in the beginning, that Venezuela has never been a country of immigration. So in that regard, networks which may have been established in the case of other countries were not necessarily present when it came to Venezuelan immigrants. And that is what I think the Colombian measure is so important, because by offering a 10 years residence permit, the government in Colombia acknowledges that the situation in Venezuela might not be solved in the coming years or in the short term. And therefore, I think that is why this is one of the fundamental elements which make this temporary status in Colombia so important, is precisely that. The fact that it's 10 years, and as Soledad and Marta were saying, it's a pragmatic approach towards the issue, and not thinking that there would be a new government in Venezuela, and not even thinking that if there is a new government in Venezuela, people will necessarily be in the position to return to Venezuela immediately. And so I think that is one of the elements that has also played an important role in the lack of coordination. And therefore, each country has been willing to grant temporary statuses, hoping that Venezuelans will return quickly and soon to Venezuela.
And Ignacio, I know you want us to move to the next question. So very briefly, just to add to that, I agree. I think there's different factors at play here. One, the temporality of the crisis itself. Also, the different moments that the projects of regional integration in Latin America, the different projects of integration and the complexity of all these new organizations as well, that Soledad was mentioning, has impacted the coordination in relation to Venezuela displacement. And here I would like to recommend as well the works on colleagues like Leisa Brumat, Leisa Margaritis. They all write constantly about, the regional approach to migration governance in Latin America, which I think is important to highlight, might have jeopardized the communal efforts. But also I think there's a constant denial in the region to recognize this also as a displacement as such. And there's a lot of political factors playing here as well, in terms of what are the temporary measures that were taken at the beginning without actually applying the expanding definition of the Cartagena Declaration, to which many of the countries are adopted into the legislation. So I think there was a collective failure at some point that plays with the internal politics in each of the country and the growing politicization of migration in the region at large. I'm going to leave it there because I can see that there are a lot of questions in the chat, but happy to chat more.
Excellent, thank you very much, all. Yes, I have several questions. To begin with, maybe one is addressed to Alexandra. Joe Shaw ask you, why two related questions. How is this measure related, if at all, to the January 2020 Colombian Constitutional Court decision relating to the nationality status of children born in Colombian territory to Venezuelan parents? And B, What will be the citizenship status of the children of the parents who have permit, both those born in Venezuela and those born in Colombia, who presumably benefit from the Constitutional Court decision mentioned under A in the previous question?
Do you want me to answer right away?
Yeah, go ahead, and then I continue with the other questions.
Yes, as a matter of fact, in 2020, we had a ruling from the Constitutional Court of Colombia, as well as another ruling regarding the access to nationality to children born to Venezuelan parents in Colombia. This was really important because, even as I said before, even for those people who had this special permit, as it was temporary, it wasn't a proof of residence. So their children couldn't access the nationality, and this was leading to statelessness. So for coping with this situation, the ruling was needed in order to tell the public authorities that they needed to make some exception regarding those children in order to avoid them from being stateless. Even if this ruling was for a precise case, a particular case, I think it might be useful for asking public authorities to consider the specific situation of migrant children in regards of the application of some rules that might be dangerous or might result in the violation of their human rights. And in concerns of the access to nationality, this new permit, it's supposed to be a proof of residence, which means the people who will have the permit will be living, considered living in Colombia. And in this sense, their children might be able to access Colombian nationality. But those who are born in Colombia, it's not the same case for children who are born in Venezuela. And in this sense, what has been said is that for accessing the permit, these children will need to have a birth certificate, which is not always the case. So there we can also see a possible difficulty for the application of the new permit in terms of proving the nationality or proving that these children were born in Venezuela and having a document, which is not always the case for Venezuelans.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Here I have another comment from Deni Pencheva, who thanks all of you for the fantastic contributions. And she asked all of you to what extent this unprecedented mobility could be captured by existing migration typologies. She also asked if Venezuelans to be treated as economic migrants or as refugees, and to what extent is this functional distinction within the legal and policy frameworks of Colombia, Peru, and Chile? A broader one, and then we continue to more specific questions.
I can quickly say two things, and perhaps Marta, Soledad, or Alexandra would like to ask something, but just to say that the only country that has granted refugee status to Venezuelans in important numbers under the expanded definition of Cartagena has been Brazil. Perhaps paradoxically, because in Brazil we have the president who is certainly the most vocal in the region in his opposition to migration, and actually Brazil has not endorsed the Global Compact on Migration, the same as Chile, as Marcia was saying. But Brazil, because of different reasons, has granted so far to around 50,000 Venezuelans refugee status. The interesting thing in the case of Brazil, there are around 250,000 Venezuelans in Brazil. And the interesting thing is that Brazil has also offered to Venezuelans the possibility to obtain a residence permit under an expanded acceptance of the Mercosur Residence Agreement, which is the agreement that allows South American nationals free movement in South America, which in theory does not apply to Venezuela because Venezuela has been suspended from Mercosur, and also because Venezuela never ratified this particular Mercosur Residence Agreement. In that regard, one final point, if I may, very quickly, one thing that is also very important and that countries in the region have not been doing is to offer Venezuelans a path towards obtaining citizenship. Despite the fact that many frameworks in South America on paper are very open when it comes to naturalization. And I'm thinking about Peru, Argentina, I'm thinking even about Colombia when it comes to Latin Americans, right? And regardless of that, Venezuelans by and large, well, not by and large, I mean, the general rule, almost 99% of Venezuelans have not been able to obtain citizenship in any of the other countries they have migrated to, even though on paper that could have been a possibility. So that is another element that we have not mentioned, which I think is also important to briefly mention.
Can I just join a little bit and jump in a couple of quick points to make? And I think I appreciate the question, Danny, in terms of the type of migration. And this is a discussion that actually I think goes beyond Latin America alone. You know, there has been, of course, a merge of humanitarian protection with development assistance, and we can see how those industries are coming together as well. Interestingly, in the last report of the UNHCR, Venezuelans come as a separate category, Venezuelan displaced person. They don't even come as refugee or asylum seekers, you know. So we can see that this type of, and the questions about the definition of what type of displacement migration they are, goes beyond Latin American alone. But since the beginning, and many of our colleagues, Felin, Leisa, Cecile Bloin, Diego as well, have written about this question, why they have not been recognized as refugees when under the expanded definition of Cartagena Declaration, they could. Basically, we could argue about generalized violence. They could, argue in relation to attempts against human rights, etc. So I think there is, of course, a complex mobility. It's not that it's one or the other one. There's, of course, economic factors, but they come with a political crisis as well. But basically, they could be refugees. Now the question is why the region decided not to take that approach. And I do wonder if at the beginning they thought that actually will encourage the mobility of other people to the countries. It could have been a reason, I'm not sure, but basically that's what they have set it up the tone in not really recognize one another one, but they do have the grounds. So in many cases, people that have decided to put an asylum application have been approved in the different countries of the region, but are less and less, particularly now in the context as well of COVID-19 with border closures. One of the big questions that have come out constantly is what's happening with people seeking asylum, because increasingly we are closing spaces of protection. And in many cases, like we saw in the case of Chile, without even receiving application, they just send them back, actually going against the non-refoulement commitment that many countries have made. Even in Brazil now, in research that we're doing with my colleague Gisela Zapata, we have seen the same effect. People is either being deported or actually make even irregular and not given the protection they need because they're not recognized asylum applications at the border. So I think it's a complex question and really raise more questions about the not only the quality, but also the state of asylum in Latin America that is consistent with the debates that we're having across the world as well.
In the case of Peru, so regarding the question whether Venezuelan nationals are considered migrants or refugees, in the Peruvian case, there has been a lot of debate. So as Marcia mentioned, scholarly, many authors have recognized that Venezuelan people meet at least one of the criteria for the Cartagena definition of refugee, because in Venezuela there are violations of human rights. But regarding the definition that the state has, or the Peruvian state has incorporated the Cartagena definition of refugee within the national legislation, but in practice, it is not applied generally, but only in a few limited and specific cases. So according to some interviews that we have conducted in the Universidad del Pacífico, I can affirm that the commission that evaluates the refugee applications only applies the Cartagena definition exceptionally, for example, in cases of extreme vulnerability when people have HIV or cancer or any serious, very serious illness which threatens the person's life, and so they need to be immediately recognized so that they can receive emergency healthcare, for example. But they are only extreme cases, so it's not usual. And most Venezuelan people are treated as migrants, and the regularization goes through regular channels. For example, like the permits that I mentioned in my presentation. And regarding nationality and citizenship, yes, it's very rare, as Diego mentioned, it's extremely rare that Venezuelan people are going to access Peruvian nationality, only for children. Because here in Peru, in contrast to Colombia, for example, all people who are born within Peruvian territory can access Peruvian nationality. And so, for example, the children who are born to Venezuelan parents here are Peruvian. But apart from that, it's very difficult to access Peruvian citizenship for them.
I will quickly jump up to say that it's an interesting question. I totally agree with all of you when you say, and especially with Marcia when she said that Venezuelans should be considered as refugees according to the Cartagena Declaration, as most of our countries have incorporated this declaration into our own legislation. For the Colombian case, there is something particular, and is that this permit is called a protection permit, and it's supposed to be founded in the grounds of a subsidiary protection which exists in international law. So it's strange because we're speaking about a protection measure, a subsidiary measure, which means we will consider all as people who are outside of their countries but need international protection. But in the same way, we are speaking, when we start regulating this permit, we see that it's more like a regularization more than a protection system. So I feel that the confusion that we obviously have in front of Venezuelans is still persistent with this system. And I also want to say that there's something that really bothers me, and it's the fact that many countries in Latin America, especially Peru, Chile, and Colombia, have an external position among Venezuela and Venezuelan politics, telling Venezuelans are suffering, Venezuela are struggling with Maduro, etc. But when it comes to protecting Venezuelans abroad, they say, no, they're migrants. So I think we really need to work this out, to think if they really are out of their country because they want to, or if this is more like an economic migration, or if these people need international protection.
Thank you very much. Now I have another one from Zoe Illingworth. I found this one quite interesting. It says, the Venezuelan migration crisis has often felt like a Latin American crisis rather than a global one. Why do you think that it has felt as such? And do you think a shift in narrative from Latin American to global crisis would encourage a larger, more focused global response? For instance, increasing fundings, a more humanitarian rather than a security response, less sanctions, etc.
I can start very quickly just saying two quick things. The first one is that, or I think the main reason for this is that, and the reason why we know very little about this in Europe is because Venezuelans, by and large, have only, we were saying 80% in South America, then there are a large number of Venezuelans in Costa Rica and Panama, a large number of Venezuelans in the Caribbean, mostly in Dominican Republic and Trinidad and Tobago, and then an important group in Mexico. And other than that, Venezuelans have emigrated or have traveled, have moved to the US, where now Biden has adopted the TPS, the temporary protection status for Venezuelans. So again, it's a temporary measure, but they will be able to reside and to work in the US. And the other group that has moved to a country outside of the region has been to Spain. And in the case of Spain, many Venezuelans have either accessed residence because they were EU citizens, either because they were Italian, Portuguese, or Spanish, or family members of Italians, Portuguese, or Spanish. Let's not forget that Venezuela has a long history of immigration of Italians, Portuguese, and Spaniards. And that is why many Venezuelans in Spain are simply EU citizens or Spanish nationals or family members of those. And the rest, in the case of Spain, have obtained not refugee status, but they have obtained humanitarian protection. other than the case of Spain, there are a few Venezuelans who have emigrated to countries like Belgium, but I think that is one of the main reasons why we don't hear that much about this outside of the region, because Venezuelans have not really moved, in this case, in our particular case here, to Europe. So I think this is one of the important reasons.
Can I just complement that a second, if that is okay with my colleagues? I agree with you, Diego, and also this relate with the time of the displacement and how it played out. Of course, many people that left at the beginning were wealthy Venezuelans that were able to go to other regions and not stay in South America. So what we see now crossing the borders are actually poor Venezuelans that are crossing in very precarious conditions, you know? So it really is a Latin American crisis. Now, what is the interest of not of the international community to shed light what happened on South America or Latin America at large? Is that, of course, many regions like Europe or the United States want to keep those Venezuelans in Latin America. Okay, that's one of the first things. So they would be willing to put funding, particularly neighbor countries like Colombia, you know, and Ecuador, to a certain extent, to put funding to keep those migrants or refugees in the region. But there has not been a widespread call. And of course, that might be related with the timing as well. There were some efforts of having this international conference to gather donations and put the international community at large to donate money, but actually to stay in the region, not to actually resettle refugees elsewhere. That's not something that has been on the table so far. So I think it's going to stay more than anything local. But the global calls, of course, have stopped because the chief, you know, and I think the pandemic, we cannot forget the context that we find ourselves, has raised priorities elsewhere. Europe is still dealing with a migration crisis as well at the first step. There's still refugee camps full of, you know, Syrian and migrants and other migrants in Greece. So I think maybe that's why the reason why we don't hear that much about it. And maybe there's still an effort, I'm pretty sure that negotiations, but always I feel the interest would be to keep them in Latin America.
Thank you very much for both of you. Now, getting back to the US that Diego was mentioning, United States, I have a question from Ezequiel Almada. He's asking if the political decision from the Colombian government was supported by the US, or is just a humanitarian measure from the government of Colombia. And I would add to this one another one that asks if a regularization program adopted by Biden changed the political debate in Chile, if there's any reasons for thinking about that. So maybe Alexandra and then Marcia, if you would like to answer these questions.
I think Marcia just gave us a hint on what my answer would be. Of course, I was supported by the United States. I should say some agencies from the United States are funding many humanitarian programs in Colombia in regards of this migration flow, especially because this is a way to stop them from going to the US. Even if we switched governments between the time when this measure was thought and the time when it was implemented, I'm sure they fully supported it because it's a way to stop these migrants from coming to the United States.
Great, and very briefly about the second question that I think Diego posed in the chat in terms of the impact of Biden. It might have an impact. I think we tend to measure many times what happened in Latin America, and we give way too much importance to what happened in the US, and it is important, don't get me wrong, you know. But I think that it will have to be the timing for the Chilean government, because they quite successfully have promoted this idea of governing through exclusion and control that actually has kind of give them some political credit. So I'm not sure if it would change massively. The signals that the Chilean government increasingly keeps sending is of increased control. They are mirroring those countries, so they constantly refer to the US, to Australian policy and European policy in order to justify their own actions. So it might be interesting to see how that plays in the next few weeks, you know, few months. But even so, even using the language of the Global Compact on Migration at the end, they didn't even sign, you know, they still use that to justify further control. So I'm not sure, I cannot play futurology here, so I'm not sure how it will impact. We have a discussion at some point in one of the papers that is currently under review about the securitization in Latin America with LESA, And what we argue there is that there's an impact, of course, of the US in what happened in different countries in the region, particularly Chile, Argentina, and Brazil. But at the same time, there are pretty much certain bureaucracies within the countries that has reinforced the arrival of securities actors within, the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that pretty much shape migration policy in Chile. So I don't think this sudden announcement will change what's going on right now, but there has been also internal pressure from civil society organizations and migrant-led organizations, and increasingly they're using the courts, to try to put a contrarrest to the government policies, which also has created further frictions between all these organizations. So I'm sorry that I don't have an answer, Diego, a concrete answer.
Excellent. Well, there's another one for Alexandra, and it says, what are the key actions the Colombian authorities should follow in order to make a comprehensive migration public policy, regulation or deregulation? This is an anonymous attendee, so I can say.
Thanks, anonymous attendance, for his question. It's a really interesting question. You know that building or designing and implementing comprehensive public policy has been a subject widely studied, but there are some key points that have been pointed out that might be useful for the Colombian case, and I'm just saying some of that comes to the tip of my mind. Like, I think that it's really important to take into the consideration other flows that come to the country if we are willing to build a really comprehensive public policy. It's not only by saying so, because this is really funny, because if you go to Colombia, you see public policy, comprehensive public, that's the name of a law, but it doesn't mean that what is contained in the law, it's a public policy, because sometimes it doesn't take into account all other flows and other aspects of those flows, such as, for instance, all the sanctionatory system for migrants and integration system for migrants is not taken into account. Also, a comprehensive public policy should be built, taking into consideration or taking into account the participation of all the levels of government. In many cases, laws or permits are adopted by the central government without taking into account the other levels of government, which will be the most impacted by these measures, in the sense that there's the little neighboring towns, the neighboring cities, which are going to deal with the application of such norms. If they are not taken into account in the public policy design and implementation, well, there will be problems, especially in terms of adaptation or integration of migrants. And also, I think it's really important, and that will be my third point, to take into consideration international commitments from states, because sometimes this just comes like an act of government, like all of a sudden I will rule differently without taking into consideration what are my international commitments, what can I say in terms of my international responsibility towards migration. So that will be my 3 key points.
Thank you very much. We have several more questions. We are running out of time. Maybe we can go with this one. One addressed to Alexandra and Marcia. What explains the U-turn of the Colombian government PEP, and why now? And to all, Pia Rigorozzi asked, in which ways this PEP would empower migrants and their rights?
Should I start, maybe? What explains the change? I think we've been talking about it. I think it's more like government has recognized how the measure that had been previously adopted were not enough, and how this was a long-lasting migratory flow. So further things were needed. Also, I think this really it's really linked to this biometrical registration system that government wanted to take in place, but they were saying we cannot just say so, we need to do something more, like regularization of migrants. And so I think there are several reasons. I don't have all of them, but I think it comes to these 2. First, this biometrical system that they wanted to put into force. Second, the fact that what has been done was not enough. And I might say the third one, it's international cooperation. As Marcia just said, we had such a pressure and we had some funding. So all this together made what has been done so far.
I think Alexandra explained it much better what I could say. Just to add that I understand that it's not a process that it was sudden. So our colleague from Universidad Nacional de Colombia, Stephanie Lopez, has been following the process closely, and they have participated in different consultations as well that the government have done, you know, with the scholars, with civil society, etc. But I think it responds not only to a need to recognize the ties, and I think Soledad and Feline raised this in their blog as well, you know, the reciprocity as well with Venezuela that received for many years many Colombian displaced population. So there's an historical tie, but there's also is a particular moment where there's funding and there's a need. And there's also this agenda, and I appreciate that you bring that, Alexander, in terms of the biometrics and how that's going to play in the region, starting with the Colombian case. So I think there's a different factors coming together. Now, the second question that Pia posed that is very interesting in terms of would empower migrants and the rights. I think in a way the temporary permits give an option, you know, to keep claiming the ladder of regularization in a way. So you can get into the resident, you know, scheme. And I think Soledad explained that at some point. So that could be definitely good for them. But there's an emphasis as well now in leave out the ones that come from an irregular channels. So of course, from those ones, we will identify them, but they won't have any rights and probably they will be deported. So I think might improve the rights for and access to rights to some migrants, particularly in terms of access to health, education, etc. But it will be a further burden to those that arrive, particularly after the period that I think is a specific date that arrive by an irregular channel. So I think there will be an issue there of lack of protection for those particular groups.
We run out of time. It's almost 5:30. Sorry for those who are not going to receive an answer to their questions. But in any case, this will be posted, the recording will be posted in the MMB Latin American website. So you will have access to all the answers and the reflections, very interesting reflections that all our speakers have done. So that's it. Thank you very much, Diego. Thank you very much, Marcia, Alexandra, and Soledad. Obviously, thank you to Emily for organizing and supporting us in this event, and hope you have an excellent Wednesday.